Have you ever noticed something, but never quite been able to explain it? Talking to someone who grew up in the 1990s feels different. Not dramatically different, not in a way that immediately stands out. But something about it stays with you. You might be sitting across from them in a coffee shop, or standing with them in a quiet hallway, and you notice something subtle. They listen without the frantic urge to interrupt. They don't rush to fill every silence, as if a pause in conversation is a system error. They are present, but they are not performing presence. Their attention is steady, grounded. Their hand doesn't twitch toward a phone every few seconds. They aren't half listening while scanning a screen. They are simply there. And strangely, they don't seem to need proof that the moment exists. At first, it is easy to misinterpret this. Maybe they are introverted. Maybe they are just relaxed. Maybe they are old-fashioned. But none of those explanations fully capture what you are sensing. Because the difference is not about personality. It is about calibration. And once you notice it, you begin to see it everywhere. To understand why this happens, we need to look at something deeper than culture or personality. We need to look at the nervous system itself. Because people born in the 1990s grew up during a transition that the human brain had never experienced before. People born in the 1990s did not simply grow up in a different era. They grew up in the middle of a neurological transition, a moment in history where the human attention system was quietly being rewired. They are the last generation that learned how to relate to the world before constant stimulation became the brain's default state. Before notifications, before endless scrolling, before the idea that every moment might be recorded, shared, or evaluated by an invisible audience. They learned something earlier generations considered normal, but later generations may never fully experience. They learned how to be bored. And boredom, surprisingly, is not a small psychological detail. It is a training ground for the nervous system. When a mind experiences silence and stillness, it learns how to regulate itself. It learns how to sit with thoughts, how to process emotions, how to remain present without external stimulation. This is the subtle quality people often sense in conversations with this generation. It is not detachment. It is regulation. Their nervous system learned how to exist with itself before it learned how to perform for others. And that difference creates a rhythm that still shapes how they move through the world today. But the story becomes even more interesting when we look at the environment that formed that rhythm. Because the world they were born into moved at a very different speed. In the early years of the 1990s, the world still moved slowly enough to feel solid. Communication required effort. If you wanted to call someone, you walked to a phone mounted on a wall. You stretched the spiral cord across the room, hoping no one else picked up the line. If you wanted to see a friend, you knocked on their door, sometimes without warning. Information was not a flood. It was a search. You opened books. You visited libraries. You waited for the evening news. And sometimes you simply did not know the answer to a question. This slower environment gave something incredibly valuable to the developing brain. Time. Time for thoughts to form. Time for curiosity to grow. Time for identity to take shape. Most importantly, life unfolded in private. When children played outside, no one was filming them. When they made mistakes, those moments faded into memory instead of living forever on the internet. Their identity developed in the quiet background of life, protected from constant observation. Psychologically, this matters more than most people realize, because identity grows differently when it develops away from an audience. But then something happened, something that changed the rhythm of attention forever. Technology did not slowly drift into everyday life. It accelerated. The internet expanded rapidly. Mobile phones became common. Social media turned everyday life into a public stage. Suddenly, speed became the expectation. Availability became the norm. Visibility became a form of currency. And the 1990s generation had to adapt while their identities were still forming. This created something unique in psychological history. They remember the before, but they live in the after. Sociologists sometimes call this a bridge generation. A bridge exists between two worlds, It does not belong fully to either side. Its purpose is to connect them. But living on a bridge can also be exhausting, because it requires constant adjustment. The rules of the analog world were slow, private, and patient. The rules of the digital world are fast, visible, and immediate. People who grew up in the 1990s understand both systems. They remember what it feels like to log off, a concept that is slowly disappearing. This ability creates a unique psychological skill. They become natural code switchers between two different environments. But the most powerful influence on their nervous system may have come from something much simpler. Moments that were never recorded. For a child growing up in the 1990s, life rarely had a record button. Moments happened once, and then they disappeared into memory. Saturday morning cartoons could not be paused. Family gatherings were documented by a single camera that often stayed in a drawer. Embarrassing moments faded instead of becoming viral clips. And joyful moments existed fully in the present, because there was no expectation that they needed to be captured or shared. This created a subtle psychological shift. When moments cannot be saved, attention stays where it belongs. In the present, the brain learns to anchor itself internally. Experiences do not need external validation to feel meaningful. You simply trust that they mattered. But perhaps the most powerful teacher of all during that era was something modern technology tries to eliminate entirely. Boredom. In the 1990s, boredom was not considered a problem. It was simply part of being alive. There was no endless stream of entertainment waiting in your pocket. No algorithm designed to rescue you from silence. When boredom appeared, it stayed. And that forced a choice. Remain uncomfortable, or create something. Children invented games with sticks and rocks. They built imaginary worlds. They daydreamed for hours. Without realizing it, they were training a powerful psychological ability. Self-regulation. Because when nothing distracts you from your emotions, the nervous system learns how to process them. Feelings rise, they peak, and eventually they fade, without needing immediate stimulation. Today, boredom is treated like a malfunction. But for the 1990s generation, boredom was a teacher. It taught them that their inner life was rich enough to hold their own attention. But living between two worlds also carries a hidden cost. People who grew up in the 1990s remember when being unreachable was normal. Privacy was not a setting you managed. It was simply life. Then almost suddenly, those rules changed. Availability became expected. Silence began to feel suspicious. Sharing became a social requirement. Navigating these two environments requires constant recalibration. And while the world often praises this generation for being adaptable, adaptability can hide a quiet burden. When you grow up learning to regulate yourself, you also learn to minimize your needs. You become skilled at handling stress alone. You appear calm on the outside, but internally there can be fatigue. The fatigue of constantly adjusting between two incompatible worlds. The fatigue of acting as a bridge. This story is not about one generation being better than another. It is about contrast. People who grew up in the 1990s carry a memory that fewer and fewer people share. A memory of attention before it was constantly divided. A memory of moments that existed without an audience. A memory of silence before it was filled. And in a world that becomes louder every year, that memory may become incredibly valuable. Because the future might not need more stimulation. It might need people who remember how to sit in stillness. People who understand that presence does not need proof. And that some moments are meaningful simply because they were lived. If this story felt familiar, you are not imagining it. There really was a shift in how the human nervous system interacts with the world. But an even more important question is emerging. What happens to a brain that never experiences boredom at all? What happens to a nervous system that grows up surrounded by constant stimulation? Psychologists are only beginning to understand the answer. And surprisingly, the future of the mind may be more hopeful than it seems. We will explore that in the next video. I will see you there.